"Doctor," the young woman spoke, so softly her voice nearly dissolved into the low hum of the air conditioning. "May I please see her scans again?" The department chief turned slowly. His silver hair caught the cold white light of the conference room, and his eyes narrowed as though he had just heard something offensive. "What did you just say to me?" "I think the tumor's position has been read wrong, doctor. This approach, it will kill her." The whole room paused for a single beat. Then came the scornful laughter. "Get this floor-scrubbing girl out of my department. You reek of bleach. Which mop bucket did you crawl out of? You can't even finish reading a shift schedule, and now you want to read an MRI?" Two residents pulled out their phones. A flash went off. Someone had already started a live stream. A nurse pressed her hand to her mouth, hiding her laughter in her sleeve, and not a single white coat in that room moved to defend her. The woman in the faded uniform, her calloused hands still trembling. In the back row, the most powerful man in Chicago sat with his head bowed, 10 fingers locked together until they turned white, over the mother who lay waiting to die. He didn't even bother to look up. No one in that room knew who the woman they had just mocked truly was. No one knew those calloused hands had once held a surgeon's scalpel, and not one of them suspected that, in less than a day, every person who had laughed at her in that room would be made to bow their heads. And subscribe to our channel, because there are many more stories like this one waiting to be told about the people the world was too quick to walk past. At 6 o'clock in the morning, while Chicago was still sunk beneath the cold gray mist of a late autumn day, Clara Reeves woke in the cramped rented room on the 3rd floor of an old building on the south side of the city. The room was so small that 3 steps could carry her across it, with a narrow single bed pushed against the wall, an electric hot plate set on top of a wooden crate, and one window looking out over the alley, where the wind slipped through the cracks in the walls and wailed in long, broken breaths. She sat up, pulled the thin blanket neatly back into place, then reached for the glass of water left to grow cold from the night before. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the glass, not because of the cold, but because 2 years of scrubbing floors and wiping surfaces with chemicals had left them with rough calluses and tiny cracks running along the joints of her fingers. On the wooden shelf beside the bed, between a few yellowed books and an old photograph turned face down, lay the only thing she cherished more than her own life. It was a steel surgical loop, compact and old, yet still polished bright in the places she cleaned again and again. On the rim were 2 initials, worn down by the years, D and R. Clara picked it up and pressed it into her palm for a long moment, as though its weight alone were enough to remind her of who she had once been. Then she slipped it into the inner pocket of her blouse, close against her chest, where she had kept it every day for the past 2 years. At 6:45, she was already standing before the gates of the Vance mansion, a massive gray stone villa set on a quiet hill in the north side, where rows of old oak trees cast their shadows over the white gravel path. She went around to the rear entrance reserved for the staff, hung her coat on a hook, put on the silver gray maid's uniform that had gone threadbare at the elbows, then tied the apron around her waist. In the mirror, she saw a 27-year-old woman with a weary face and eyes that still held the keen sharpness of someone once trained to notice the smallest detail. She lowered her gaze, as she had grown used to lowering it for 2 years, and stepped inside. Clara's whole day passed in the silence of a shadow. She wiped mirrors that rose all the way to the ceiling, polished the walnut banister of the staircase, and rearranged the vases of flowers in the grand sitting room. People walked past her without looking, spoke in front of her as though she didn't exist, summoned her with a tilt of the head or the ring of a bell. To the wealthy guests who came and went through that house, she was only another piece of the furnishings, as invisible as the curtains or a chair. And Clara accepted that invisibility, because invisibility was the only thing that kept her safe. Near noon, while cleaning the study on the 2nd floor, she froze. On a small table beside the window, someone had left behind a thick leather-bound book with a peeling cover, its spine printed with words she would have recognized even with her eyes closed. It was an atlas of neuroanatomy, the kind of book she had once read until every page lived inside her memory, in another lifetime. Her hand set the cleaning cloth down by instinct. She opened the book, turned the pages slowly, and her eyes lingered for a long time on the familiar illustrations, the lines of the base of the skull, the delicate little vessels winding around the brainstem, the shapes she had once been able to draw from memory with only 3 strokes of a pen. In that moment, her face changed. The resignation faded, giving way to an old light she had believed she had buried long ago. The sound of footsteps from the hallway startled her. Clara hurriedly closed the book, returned it to its exact place, picked up the cloth, and lowered her head as though nothing had happened. But her heart was still pounding, and her calloused fingers still carried the feeling of those pages, as though she had just touched a part of herself the world had forced her to leave behind. She didn't know that only a few hours later, the very knowledge she was trying so hard to hide would pull her out of the darkness and place her in the middle of a brightly lit room before the eyes of people who would laugh at her. Among all the people who lived and worked beneath that enormous roof, only one person treated Clara like a real human being, and that was Mrs. Ruth Vance, the elderly mother of the mansion's owner. She was 66 years old, her thin silver hair always combed neatly into place, and although her body had grown much weaker in recent months, her eyes still carried the warmth of a woman who had spent decades standing before a classroom. Ruth never summoned Clara with a bell. She called her by name, invited her to sit down for tea every afternoon, asked whether she had slept well the night before, and sometimes, during those long, quiet afternoons, she told Clara about the little students she had taught many years ago. To Ruth, Clara wasn't a shadow. She was a companion, almost the daughter Ruth had never had. That afternoon, when Clara carried the tea tray into the reading room where Ruth usually sat, she noticed something that made her steps slow. Mrs. Ruth rose from her chair to take the teacup, but her right hand trembled in an unusual way, her fingers unable to close fully around the handle, and when she walked toward the window, her gait tilted to one side, as though one half of her body no longer entirely obeyed her will. To someone else, it would have been only a sign of old age, but to eyes trained through years spent in hospital rooms, Clara recognized at once that this wasn't ordinary aging. It was the sign of something pressing into a very deep place inside. Something dangerous. She set the tea tray down, hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly, her voice gentle but unable to hide its worry. "Ma'am, I've noticed that your right hand has been trembling lately, and you're not walking as steadily as before. You should have it examined more carefully, not just a simple general checkup, but another scan of your head." Ruth only smiled, patted the back of Clara's hand lightly, and said she was getting old, that weak limbs were only natural, that the family's private physician had examined her the week before and said it was merely nervous tension, nothing to worry about. Clara wanted to say more, wanted to explain that those symptoms, taken together, weren't harmless at all, but she stopped herself in time. She was only a maid. A maid wasn't supposed to know such things, and even less was she allowed to say them aloud. Just then, Dolores Pratt, the head housekeeper, who had been with the Vance family for more than 20 years, stepped into the room. She was a stout woman with a kind face, salt and pepper hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, and she was the only person in this house who had ever noticed the strange things about Clara. More than once, she had caught Clara quietly reading thick books during her break. She had seen the way Clara bandaged a gardener's cut hand, with a skill that was strangely practiced. She had heard Clara murmuring words that a cleaning woman should never have known. Dolores looked at Clara now, a flicker of understanding passing through her eyes, then said softly to Ruth, "Ma'am, perhaps you should listen to our little doctor here. This girl has a sharp eye for people. I trust her." That name, Little Doctor, was what Dolores had secretly called Clara, half in jest and half in earnest, but inside it was a respect that no one else in the house had ever given her. Clara lowered her head, not daring to accept the praise, but inside her, an uneasiness rose that she couldn't put into words. She knew what she had seen, and she knew that if no one was willing to listen, the thing growing inside the head of that kind woman would not wait for anyone. That night, when she returned to her cramped, rented room, she took out the loupe, engraved with the letters D and R again, turning it in her hands beneath the weak yellow light, and for the first time in a very long while, she felt something stirring inside her that she had believed she had lost long ago, the longing to save a human life. That loupe did not belong to Clara. It had belonged to her father, and to understand why a maid could read signs that even a private physician had missed, one had to go back many years, to the time when Clara Reeves still carried a name tied to the hope of an entire hospital. Her father, Dr. Daniel Reeves, was one of the most gifted neurosurgeons the medical world of the Midwest had ever known. He was a quiet man, with long, steady hands, calm eyes, and an intellect capable of seeing into the darkest regions of the human brain, places where most of his colleagues only dared to stand at a distance and look on. For many years, Dr. Daniel had quietly developed a technique for approaching tumors buried deep beneath the base of the skull, tumors that the medical world at that time had declared untouchable, inoperable, beyond saving. His technique opened a new corridor, a path no one before him had dared to imagine, and it promised to save thousands of lives that medicine had seemed to abandon. Clara grew up among anatomical drawings, spread across the dining table, falling asleep to the sound of her father describing the blood vessels of the brainstem the way other people told fairy tales, and from the time she was little, she knew she would follow in his footsteps. She entered medical school, then became an outstanding neurosurgery resident, praised by professors for having hands and eyes exactly like her father's. Her future stretched before her, bright as a summer dawn, but all of it collapsed in a single winter. When Dr. Daniel's work was about to be published and recognized, a man above him in the hospital system, a man rich in ambition and power, made his move. He quietly seized all of Dr. Daniel's research, erased his name from every page of the documents, then published the technique under his own name, turning the life's work of a true physician into a stepping stone for his own glory. Dr. Daniel was not a man who could remain silent before a lie. He stood up and accused him, bringing evidence that proved the work was his, but he had been too naive to believe that truth could protect itself. The other man had money, power, and an entire network of people willing to turn their backs on conscience in order to keep their positions. They staged everything to make Dr. Daniel look like the fraud, smeared his honor, stripped away his medical license, and pushed him out of the profession he had lived and nearly died for. Then, one rainy night, Dr. Daniel was gone in a car crash that Clara still, even now, did not believe was an accident. The case was closed in haste, and along with her father, the truth was buried too. His death dragged everything else down with it. Medical and legal debts piled up and came crashing over them. The house was sold, and Clara, in the deepest agony of her life, lost faith in the very system she had once worshipped. She left medicine, not because she lacked talent, but because she could no longer bear to wear the same white coat as the people who had killed her father. She vanished from that world, buried the person she had once been, and accepted life as an unnamed maid just to survive from one day to the next. The only thing she kept from the life she had lost was her father's surgical loop, with the 2 letters engraved on the rim, D and R, standing for Daniel Reeves. Every night she picked it up, and every night she told herself she had let everything go. But what Clara did not know, what fate was quietly arranging, was that the man who had stolen her father's work and his life, the man who had pushed her own life into the abyss, was the very same man who had been sitting inside the Vance mansion a few days earlier, as a doctor. The man who had just signed a death sentence for the mother of Elliot Vance, the most powerful boss in Chicago. The man sitting with his head bowed in the consultation room that day. The one everyone in the room seemed to see only as a wealthy client grieving over his mother, was in truth a name that made all of Chicago lower its voice whenever it was spoken. Elliot Vance, 34 years old, was the head of an underground empire that stretched across the city, controlling the most lucrative real estate contracts, the agreements, no written contract in black ink on white paper ever recorded, and powerful people who always had to be careful whenever his name came up. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a cold, angular face, a hard jaw, and dark eyes, as still as the surface of a lake, frozen over in the dead of winter, the kind of gaze that made the person across from him feel as though every lie had already been exposed before it could leave their mouth. He never needed to raise his voice, because his silence alone was heavy enough to crush an entire room. Earlier that same week, in a conference room high above the city inside a glass tower overlooking the Chicago River, a board of people in expensive suits was arguing fiercely over a project they believed they could slip past him. When the conference room door opened and Elliot stepped in, without a greeting, without a hurried footstep, every voice died at once, as though someone had pulled all the air out of the room. Men who were used to giving orders to others suddenly sat up straight. A few reached up to loosen their collars, and one of them unconsciously pushed his glass of water farther away, as if he needed something to do with his trembling hands. Elliot did not sit down. He simply stood at the head of the table, placed a thin folder on the polished wood, pushed it lightly toward the man seated opposite him, then spoke in a low, even voice. "You thought I didn't know what you were discussing behind my back, but there isn't a single dark corner in this city that I don't see, so I advise you to think very carefully about your next move." No one dared answer. The man who received the folder opened it, skimmed a few lines, and his face slowly drained white as paper, because inside it was everything he had believed he had hidden. Elliot did not say another word. He only let those cold eyes move across the room, a gaze that held no anger, which made it even more frightening than anger, then turned and walked out. When the door closed behind him, the whole room finally dared to breathe, and someone had to sit still for a long while before he could steady himself again. That was how Elliot Vance ruled his world, not with loud threats, but with a cold authority that made people bow their heads of their own accord. But there was only one place in the world where that iron-hearted man was no longer a boss. It was the small room in the mansion where his mother, Mrs. Ruth, rested every afternoon. When he entered that room, Elliot seemed to take off the invisible armor he wore before the rest of the world. He sat on the edge of her bed, carefully straightened her blanket, and the hands that had made the most powerful men in the city tremble became strangely gentle as he lifted a glass of water to her lips. He asked whether she had eaten well that day, whether she had slept peacefully the night before, and he listened to every word she told him, about the garden, about the flowers, about memories from long ago, as though those were the most important things in the world. Because to Elliot, the mother who had worn herself thin, raising him alone from the days when they had nothing, was his only weakness, the only crack in the cold fortress he had built around his heart. And now, as he heard the doctor's cold declaration that his mother had only a few weeks left to live, for the first time in his life, the most powerful man in Chicago felt utterly helpless, because all the money and power he possessed couldn't buy even one more spring for his aging mother. The official consultation took place on a cold gray morning at the prestigious private hospital of St. Bartholomew, where marble walls and spotless corridors gave off the solemn grandeur of money and power. The man presiding over the consultation was Marshall Kane, 57 years old, chief of neurosurgery, a man with smooth, brushed silver hair and a proud, upright bearing, wearing a white coat over a carefully tailored pinstripe suit. In the hospital's main hall hung an oil portrait of him, and beneath it was a line praising the talent and judgment of the physician. Each time Kane walked past it, he lifted his head a little higher. He entered the consultation room with the bearing of a man accustomed to having the whole world bow before him, placed the scans on the table, then began speaking in the cold, decisive tone of someone who believed every word from his mouth was the final truth. He explained that Mrs. Ruth's tumor lay deep beneath the base of the skull and had progressed to a stage where intervention was impossible, that it clung too closely to the blood vessels feeding the brainstem, that any surgical blade touching it would immediately take the patient's life, and that after more than 20 years of experience and countless cases passing through his hands, he could state with certainty that there wasn't a doctor anywhere in the world who could save her. His advice was to take her home, provide palliative care, and prepare for the worst, because the time she had left could be measured only in a few short weeks. What no one in that room knew, what only Kane himself understood, was that he fully recognized the true position of the tumor and knew very well that there was a technique in this world capable of reaching it, a surgical pathway he himself had once read, once studied, once stolen. But to admit that technique existed, he would have to admit it wasn't his. He would have to drag back out of the darkness the name of the man he had buried, along with that man's honor and life, many years before, and Marshall Kane would rather let an old woman die than allow the lie of his entire life to be exposed. Elliot sat listening to every word from the doctor, and with each cold sentence, he felt the ground beneath him collapsing. The man who had never bowed his head to anyone, the man who could make an entire council of powerful people turn pale with a single look, now sagged in his chair, his shoulders trembling, his hands that had once held the fates of so many people now helplessly covering his face. He had been ready to pay any price. He had prepared a check large enough to buy an entire hospital, but in the face of death, all his power and money became meaningless. He looked up at Kane, his voice hoarse, and asked whether there truly wasn't another path, not even the faintest thread of hope. Kane only shook his head with cool pity and replied that sometimes the most merciful thing a person could do was accept the limits of fate. While her son was breaking apart, Mrs. Ruth was the calmest person in the room. She sat quietly in her wheelchair, her thin hands folded neatly in her lap, and on her lips there hovered the gentle smile of someone who had lived long enough to no longer fear what could not be avoided. She reached for her son's hand, squeezed it lightly, then said that she didn't beg for many more years. She only wished to return to the old house, to sit beside the familiar window and watch the magnolia tree in the front yard bloom for one more spring, because to her, seeing those white petals open one more time would already be a gift beyond measure. Her simple words made the whole room fall silent, and even Kane had to turn his face slightly away. But what no one in that room could have expected was that only a few hours later, the woman in the faded maid's uniform pushing that elderly woman's wheelchair would shake everything to its core. The reason Clara was present in that fateful room was actually very simple. Because Mrs. Ruth herself had asked Clara to come with her. The old woman didn't trust anyone else to push her wheelchair, didn't want anyone else to straighten her scarf or support her elbow whenever the chair rolled over the thresholds, and so they had no choice but to let the quiet maid stand tucked into a corner of the consultation room, invisible as always. Clara had intended to simply stand there, head lowered, fulfilling the duty of a shadow, just as she had done for the past 2 years. But when Mrs. Ruth's scans were enlarged on the screen hanging on the wall, every plan Clara had disappeared in an instant. Her eyes trained through thousands of hours in reading rooms and operating rooms, couldn't pull themselves away from that image, and what she saw made her heart tighten. The tumor wasn't in the position the department chief had just declared. It was shifted to one side, lying at an angle that, if seen only in passing, could easily be mistaken as unreachable. But if one looked closely, if one understood the true structure of that region at the base of the skull, one would see that there was a narrow corridor, a fragile opening between the blood vessels, through which a surgical blade could still slip in and reach the tumor. It was the very pathway her father had spent his whole life uncovering. The pathway she had known by heart from the drawings spread across the dining table when she was a child. And worse still, the approach angle the department chief was proposing, the one he had drawn with such confident lines across the scan, wouldn't save anyone at all. It would tear directly into the blood vessels feeding the brainstem, and the patient would be gone on the operating table within only a few brief moments. Inside Clara, a violent struggle rose, one no one in that room could see. One part of her screamed that she should stay silent, that she had lost everything because of this profession, that opening her mouth meant exposing herself, dragging herself out of the safe darkness where she had hidden for 2 years, and facing the very system of power that had crushed her father. She told herself this wasn't the business of a maid, that all she had to do was push the wheelchair and return to her rented room, and no one would blame her. But another part of her, the true self she had tried to bury but had never managed to kill, couldn't turn away. Before her was a kind human being, the only woman left in this world who still treated her with the warmth of a mother, and that old woman was about to be sent home to wait for death because of a mistake Clara could see clearly. If she stayed silent, Mrs. Ruth would die, and Clara would have to live the rest of her life knowing she could have spoken but had chosen cowardice. And then compassion won over fear. Her small voice rose in the middle of the room, fragile but enough to make every pair of eyes turn toward her, and what happened afterward unfolded as swiftly as a storm. She had not yet managed to fully explain what she had seen, had not yet managed to show them the pathway she knew existed, before cruel words came raining down on her like hail, the scoffs, the raised phones, and the cold contempt from all the people in white coats inside that room. 2 security guards were called in, each one gripping one of her arms, and they escorted her out of the consultation room as though she were a deranged troublemaker. As she was dragged away, Clara did not cry, did not beg, did not try to struggle. She only turned her head back one final time, looking toward Mrs. Ruth, who sat frozen in her wheelchair with wide eyes full of confusion. And in the eyes of that maid, there was no shame at all, only the sorrow of someone who had just seen a life unjustly condemned. News of the incident spread faster than Clara could have imagined. Within a single hour, the video of a maid daring to lecture the renowned department chief had circulated through the hospital corridors, and somehow it also reached the human resources managers of the housekeeping service company where she was employed. Before Clara could even steady herself after being pushed out of the consultation room, a call was already waiting, and the cold voice on the other end informed her that her contract had been terminated immediately because she had caused a scandal that damaged the reputation of a client. No one needed to hear her explain. No one cared what she had seen, because in their eyes, a cleaning woman had no right to have an opinion, and even less did she have the right to embarrass a celebrated physician. Along with her job, she lost her rented room as well, because next month's rent was supposed to be paid from the wages she would now never receive. That afternoon, rain fell over Chicago. The icy late autumn drops lashed against the pavement, slipped through her thin coat, and soaked all the way into her bones. Clara stood beneath the awning of a closed shop across the street, watching the hurried stream of people pass by with umbrellas hiding their faces. not a single one noticing the drenched woman standing there shivering with a cloth bag that held everything she had left in the world. She reached into the inner pocket near her chest and took out her father's loupe. Beneath the weak yellow glow of the streetlight reflected through the curtain of rain, the 2 letters engraved on the rim, D and R, appeared faintly in her palm. She gripped it tightly, and in that moment, her whole life seemed to gather itself into one question. She could turn her back and walk away. That would be the easiest thing, the most reasonable thing. She had already lost everything to this profession once, had paid the price with her father, with her career, with her very faith in people. Now she had just lost her job and her roof as well, only because she had dared to open her mouth, and no one in this world could demand that she sacrifice anything more. She could leave this city, go somewhere far away, begin another nameless life, and let the world keep turning in its unjust way. Mrs. Ruth was not her blood, not her responsibility, and if that old woman passed away, it would be the decision of those powerful people in white coats, not the fault of a maid who had already been fired. Her reason cried out exactly that, urging her to save herself first. But when she closed her eyes, the image that rose in her mind was not her own safety, but Mrs. Ruth's kind face, the trembling hand that had once held hers and called her by an affectionate name, the gentle smile of a woman who only wished to see one more season of magnolia blossoms before closing her eyes. And then she thought of her father, of the man who had spent his whole life opening a path to save people, a path that now only she in this world knew how to cross. If she walked away now, it wouldn't be only one life that would be lost. Her father's legacy would also be buried forever, along with that old woman. Clara opened her eyes, and in those eyes soaked with rain, fear had faded, giving way to a steadiness she had believed she had lost long ago. She clenched the loupe one final time, slipped it back into her pocket, then pulled the collar of her coat higher and stepped straight into the rain. She had nothing left to lose. And precisely because she had nothing left to lose, for the first time in 2 years, she felt free to do what was right. She would go back, not because anyone had forced her, but because she chose to. While Clara walked through the rain with a determination newly kindled inside her, Elliot remained motionless in the dark-paneled study of the Vance mansion, seated before the large wooden desk, his dark eyes fixed on empty space. The doctor's sentence still echoed in his mind, but something else kept clawing at his thoughts as well. The image of the maid in the faded silver uniform being escorted out of the consultation room. He had sat with his head bowed through that entire morning, submerged in his own grief. But his ears had still heard every word she said, and there was something in the way she spoke those medical terms that he couldn't dismiss. A cleaning woman didn't speak like that. A cleaning woman didn't look at a scan and point out a surgical pathway with the cold certainty of someone who had once held a scalpel. The instinct of a man who had spent his whole life in the underworld, where survival depended on the ability to read people, told him that woman was not nearly as simple as she appeared. Elliot picked up the phone and called the man he trusted most, a quiet man who handled information gathering for the organization, ordering him to investigate everything about the maid who had just been fired from his house. He wanted to know who she was, where she had come from, and why someone who scrubbed floors for a living could speak about neurosurgery as though reciting a book she knew by heart. His order was carried out with a speed only his power and money could buy. Within a few short hours, a thin file was placed on his desk, and when Elliot opened it and read line by line beneath the desk lamp, his face, usually cold as ice, slowly began to change. Before him was not the background of an ordinary maid, but the story of a neurosurgery resident once held up as a bright hope by the medical world, a rare talent who had vanished from medicine under mysterious circumstances 2 years earlier. And when he read the name of her father, Dr. Daniel Reeves, along with the work he had left behind, Elliot's heart seemed to miss a beat, because he recognized that the technique for approaching tumors at the base of the skull mentioned in the file was the only ray of hope, the only path to life that might save his mother. That night, Elliot's men found Clara sheltering from the rain beneath an awning near the bus station, and they brought her back to the mansion. She entered his dark study with her clothes still damp, her hair plastered to her forehead, but her posture was straight, and her eyes did not turn away. Elliot sat behind the desk, silently studying her for a long while with the sharp gaze he used to measure every person who stepped into his world. Then he spoke, his voice low and flat, asking why someone like her had chosen to scrub floors instead of holding a scalpel. Clara did not answer at once. She understood that the man before her was not someone easily deceived, and that any lie would be seen through. He continued to test her, asking questions as sharp as blades about the tumor's position, about the risks, about why she dared to be certain that the famous department chief was wrong. He asked what she had to guarantee it, and what would happen if he trusted her and she failed. Clara answered each question calmly and clearly, without grandstanding and without faltering. And the more he listened to her speak, the more Elliot realized that this woman's eyes did not hold the recklessness of a mad person, but the certainty of someone who truly understood what she was talking about. At last, he leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression entirely different from the one he had worn at first. The look of a suspicious man who, for the first time in his life, felt that he might be able to place his trust in a stranger. In that silent study, as Elliot sat across from the woman who had just forced him to reconsider everything he believed, a larger truth slowly emerged in his mind, and it left him stunned into stillness. He had read the name Daniel Reeves in the file, along with the work the man had left behind, but only now, as he looked into Clara's eyes and listened to her speak about that surgical pathway, with an understanding that reached down to the smallest detail, did he truly grasp the strange connection fate was laying before him. The technique for approaching tumors at the base of the skull, the only path to life that could save his mother, was the legacy of the father this young woman sitting before him had lost. The man who had created that method wasn't some distant name in a file, but Clara's own father, the man whose work had been stolen, whose honor had been destroyed, and who had been driven to his death. And now his only daughter, the full heir to his talent and knowledge, was standing before Elliot in the soaked clothes of an abandoned maid. The more Elliot thought about it, the more he recognized another truth that shook him even harder. The doctor who had sentenced his mother to death, the man who had insisted with absolute certainty that no one in the world could save her, was the very man who held and concealed the technique that could save her life. If Clara was right, if that surgical path truly existed, then it meant the famous department chief had deliberately allowed his mother to die, not because he was helpless, but because of some dark reason tied to the stolen work itself. Two tragedies that seemed separated by years, the death of a brilliant physician and the sentence placed upon his mother, were in fact connected by the same thread, and at the end of that thread was the same man. Saving his mother and restoring the honor of Clara's late father were not two separate roads. In truth, they were one. For his mother to live, the truth about Dr. Daniel Reeves had to be brought into the light. Elliot rose from his chair, walked to the tall window overlooking the glittering lights of Chicago at night, and stood there for a long while in silence. He was a man accustomed to calculating every risk, weighing every move before he acted, and his reason understood clearly that placing his mother's life in the hands of an unlicensed maid was a mad gamble that any sane person would refuse. But he also understood something else, something deeper than calculation. The road those powerful men in white coats had laid before him led to only one end, and that end was death. They had closed every door and told him to accept fate. This woman, by contrast, was the only door still slightly open, even if it was only a fragile sliver of light. And in that sliver of light, he saw not only hope for his mother, but a justice buried far too long, waiting to be awakened. He turned back, looked straight into Clara's eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer the voice of a suspicious man testing her, but the voice of a man who had made the most important decision of his life. He told her that he knew who she was, knew who her father was, and knew what had been done to her family. He said he would place the life of the most precious person in his world into her hands, not because he had no other choice, but because for the first time, he believed there was someone who truly wanted to save his mother instead of surrendering her to death. And he promised that if she agreed to walk this path with him, then he, with all the power he held in his hands, would help return to her father the clean name that had been stolen from him. Clara looked at him, and in her eyes, for the first time after 2 long years, there flashed the light of a person who had just found a reason to fight again. The next morning, under pressure from Elliot Vance that could not be refused, St. Bartholomew Hospital was forced to convene an expanded consultation, and this time, the woman who had once been escorted out of that room returned not in a maid's uniform, but in simple, clean clothes, with her father's loop pinned at her collar like a silent medal. When Clara stepped into the consultation room, the room full of doctors and specialists in white coats looked at her with eyes mixed with curiosity and contempt, because the rumor of the maid who had dared to lecture the department chief had already spread everywhere. They were waiting to witness an act of self-humiliation, waiting for this young woman to stammer a few meaningless sentences and then lower her head in apology. But what happened next forced every one of them to swallow the mocking smiles already waiting on their lips. Clara walked to the large screen where Mrs. Ruth's scan had once again been enlarged, and she began to speak. Her voice was soft at first, but the more she spoke, the steadier it became, and every word she uttered carried the weight of a deep understanding that no one in that room could deny. She pointed to the true position of the tumor, explained why the previous reading of the scan had mistaken its angle, then laid out the approach her father had pioneered, describing each layer of structure the scalpel would have to pass through, each blood vessel that had to be avoided, each anatomical landmark that had to be followed. She spoke of things most of the people in that room had only read about in books and had never dared perform, and she spoke of them like someone who had lived with them her entire life. Little by little, the murmurs stopped, the sneering smiles disappeared, and the whole room sank into a thick silence. A few young doctors began to nod, their eyes shining with astonishment, because they recognized that what this woman was presenting was not the rambling of a mad person at all, but a method with a solid foundation, a real path that could save the patient. It was at that moment that Marshal Kane shot to his feet. His face flushed red with anger, but behind that anger, one could see something else he was trying to hide, and that was fear. He knew exactly what the surgical pathway this young woman had just presented was, because he himself had stolen it, had buried it along with the name of the man who created it. If she were allowed to continue, if that method succeeded, then the whole world would ask a question he never dared let anyone ask: where this technique had come from, and who had truly thought of it first. He shouted that this was a farce, that allowing an unlicensed person, a cleaning woman, to stand there and lecture them about neurosurgery was an insult to the entire medical profession, that if anyone was foolish enough to believe this nonsense, the patient's death would rest on their conscience. But Clara did not step back. She turned and looked straight into his eyes, and for the first time, her voice rang out with open defiance. She asked that if this method was nothing but nonsense, why was he so frightened of it? She asked how a surgical pathway that supposedly could not exist could make such a powerful department chief tremble like this. Each of her questions was like a blade driven straight into the thing Kane was trying to keep hidden, and the more he shouted, the more he revealed his own confusion. The air in the room grew so tense it was hard to breathe. The two people standing at opposite ends of the room staring at each other like opponents in a battle where the victory or defeat at stake was not only one operation, but the truth that had been buried for many years. And in that heavy silence, another voice suddenly rose from the back of the room, a voice that would change everything. The voice that rose from the back of the room belonged to Dr. Nadia Brooks, a 38-year-old female surgeon with a tall, composed figure and neatly cropped dark blonde hair. She was one of the few gifted young doctors at the hospital, known for being quiet and for always staying away from internal disputes, so the fact that she spoke up at this moment made every eye in the room turn toward her in astonishment. Nadia stepped out from the row of seats and moved closer to the projection screen, her eyes fixed on the surgical pathway Clara had just traced, and across her face appeared an emotion difficult to name, both stunned and deeply moved. She slowly said that she had seen this method before, that she had once learned it many years earlier from the teacher she respected most in her life. She explained that when she was still an inexperienced medical student, she had been fortunate enough to study under a brilliant neurosurgeon, a man who had taught her not only technique, but medical ethics, a man who had quietly developed a pathway to approach tumors at the base of the skull, something the entire medical world at that time believed to be impossible. Nadia turned to look at Clara, and in that moment, she recognized the strange resemblance between the way this woman presented the method and the way her teacher had once explained it years ago. Her voice trembling, she asked Clara whether this surgical pathway was the legacy of Dr. Daniel Reeves. When Clara gave a slight nod and confirmed that he was her father, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. Nadia stood frozen for a moment, her eyes filling with tears, because she had just realized that the teacher she thought the world had forgotten, the man she had always believed innocent even after his honor had been stained, had in fact left behind an heir, and his method had not died with him. She turned back to face the entire board, and with a courage she herself had not known she possessed, she declared that she believed in this method, that she had seen its scientific foundation with her own eyes from the very man who had created it, and that she was willing to step forward and perform the operation alongside Clara. Nadia's declaration was an act filled with risk, because she knew very well that standing with a cast-aside maid and against the most powerful department chief in the hospital meant she might lose the career she had spent years building. But she chose to stand on the side of truth, because she knew she could not go on living with herself if she remained silent while her teacher's legacy was buried one more time. Marshal Kane went pale. Through clenched teeth, he warned Nadia that she was destroying her own future, that no one would be able to protect her if things went wrong. But Nadia answered only with a steady look, and said there were things more important than the future, and one of them was the conscience of a physician. At the exact moment when the confrontation reached its breaking point, the door of the consultation room opened, and Elliot Vance stepped in with his familiar cold composure. His presence immediately changed the entire atmosphere in the room, because even the proudest doctors understood the weight carried by that name. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply walked to the center of the room, set his dark gaze on the hospital leadership, and said in a low, decisive voice that he would take full responsibility for this operation, that he wanted it carried out with Dr. Brooks holding the scalpel and this woman guiding the procedure, and that if the hospital refused, he would have his own way of bringing every truth hidden inside these walls into the light. His words were not a loud threat, but a cold statement of fact that left the hospital leadership glancing at one another in confusion. In the end, under Elliot's pressure, and before the undeniable truth Clara and Nadia had just exposed, they were forced to agree to let the operation proceed, and Mrs. Ruth's fate, along with the honor of a man long gone, was now placed entirely in the hands of those brave enough to stand up for what was right. The night before, the operation descended slowly and quietly, as though the entire city of Chicago were holding its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. In the hospital room specially prepared for Mrs. Ruth, the lights had been dimmed to a soft, gentle warmth, and Clara sat down on the edge of the bed, holding the frail hand of the woman she had decided to risk the rest of her life to save. Mrs. Ruth was awake and strangely calm, her eyes shining with the serenity of someone who had already made peace with her fate. She squeezed Clara's hand lightly, then said she had known from the very beginning that Clara wasn't an ordinary maid, that there was a light in her eyes she had never seen in the other servants, and that she had never regretted treating Clara like her own daughter. She said that no matter what happened tomorrow, whether Clara succeeded or not, she was already at peace, because she knew there was still one person in this world willing to place herself in danger just to give her one more chance to live. Those words made Clara turn her face away to hide the tears gathering in her eyes. It had been far too long since anyone had spoken to her with the warm voice of a mother, and in that moment, she realized that the woman lying in this hospital bed was not only a patient, but had become part of the family Clara had believed she had lost completely. She bent down, placed a gentle kiss on Mrs. Ruth's forehead, and promised that she would do everything within her power, that Ruth should sleep peacefully tonight, because tomorrow, when she woke, she would see the sunlight again, and then she would go home to watch her magnolia tree bloom. Mrs. Ruth smiled, closed her eyes, and slowly drifted into sleep with a face as peaceful as a child's. When Clara stepped out of the hospital room, she saw Elliot standing silently in the hallway, his back against the cold wall, his dark eyes looking far away. He had been standing there for a long while, listening to what his mother said to Clara through the narrow opening of the door. The two of them stood side by side in the quiet corridor, and for the first time since they had met, the hard armor between them seemed to melt away. Elliot spoke softly, his voice lower and quieter than usual, saying that he had grown used to loss from a very young age, used to carrying everything alone, and had built a wall around his heart so no one could ever hurt him again. But his mother was the only exception, the only person who had stayed with him through all the dark years, and the thought of losing her frightened him in a way no enemy ever had. Clara listened, and she understood that pain better than anyone, because she too had once lost the person she loved most in the world. She answered with her own story, telling him about the father who had taught her to draw the lines of the brain before she even knew how to ride a bicycle, about the way he had always believed medicine was born to serve people, not glory, and about the fateful rainy night that had taken him from her. Those two wounded people stood in the empty hallway, sharing wounds they had never dared reveal to anyone, and in that quiet understanding, an invisible thread formed between them. When Elliot left to sit beside his mother for a little while longer, Clara returned to the small room reserved for doctors, sat beneath the light, and took her father's loop from her collar. She held it in her hand, closed her eyes, and in her mind, Every step of tomorrow's operation appeared as clearly as pages she had memorized. She reviewed every cut, every stopping point, every decision her father had taught her, and in the darkness, she whispered to him that tomorrow his legacy would live again, and it would save a human life. The next morning, operating room number 3 at St. Bartholomew Hospital blazed beneath cold white lights, and inside it, the air was so tense it seemed almost possible to touch. Mrs. Ruth lay motionless on the operating table, sunk deep into the sleep of anesthesia, while around her, an entire surgical team held its breath and waited. Nadia Brooks stood in the position of the surgeon holding the scalpel, her gloved hands ready, but her eyes kept searching toward Clara, because according to the agreement they had made, the person guiding this operation was not Nadia, but the woman standing right beside her. The woman who was not allowed to hold the scalpel herself, yet was the only one who truly knew the path they had to take. Clara stood there, her father's loop now fixed solemnly before her eyes, and when she gave the signal to begin, there was no tremor left in her voice, only the absolute calm of a person who had been waiting for this moment for 2 years. The first incisions were made according to Clara's brief and precise instructions. She did not speak much. Each command was only a few words, but every word was clear and decisive, guiding Nadia's hands deeper into the pathway her father had pioneered. "A little to the right," Clara said softly. "Now stop. Back half a measure. Follow this curve." Nadia obeyed every word, her hands steady and trusting, because she realized this woman was not feeling her way blindly, but walking a path already drawn inside her mind, a path whose every turn she knew by heart. The entire room watched in breathless silence, and the doctors who had come there with doubt in their hearts now could not take their eyes away from the seamless coordination unfolding before them. The clock on the wall moved second by second, and with every passing second, the blade drew closer to the deadly tumor buried deep beneath the base of the skull. But just when everything seemed to be proceeding smoothly, an unexpected crisis struck. As the surgical path had only just reached the edge of the tumor, one of Mrs. Ruth's vital signs on the monitor suddenly shifted, and the alarm shrieked, tearing through the quiet air of the room. The anesthesiologist, frightened, announced that the patient's blood pressure was dropping fast, that a small blood vessel had been damaged unexpectedly, and that unless it was handled immediately, everything would spiral out of control within moments. Nadia's hand froze, and for the first time since the operation had begun, panic showed clearly on her face. She looked up at Clara, her eyes pleading for help, and in that instant, the entire room seemed to stand on the edge of disaster, because this was exactly what Marshal Kane had warned them about, exactly the death he had predicted. In a heartbeat, every eye turned toward Clara, waiting to see what this woman would do. An ordinary person would have panicked, would have faltered, would have let fear freeze her reason in place. But Clara did not waver. Behind the lenses of the loop, her eyes remained sharp and still, because this situation was not unfamiliar to her. This was one of the very risks her father had foreseen and had taught her how to overcome. She drew a deep breath, then spoke, her voice strangely calm amid the shrill alarm, telling the entire team to stay steady, that no one should panic. She quickly delivered a rapid but coherent series of instructions, guiding Nadia on how to control the injured point, how to keep the surgical pathway from being disrupted, and how to stabilize the situation before it was too late. Nadia's hands, strengthened by the steadiness in Clara's calm voice, began moving again, according to each instruction, and the entire room held its breath, watching the battle for each second between life and death unfold right before their eyes. The minutes that followed passed like a breathless struggle between human hands and death itself. Under Clara's rapid but coherent guidance, the injured point was slowly brought under control. The alarm sounded less and less often before falling silent altogether, and Mrs. Ruth's vital signs gradually stabilized again. The entire surgical team let out a breath of relief, but no one dared relax, because the hardest part, the most dangerous part of the operation, still lay ahead. The scalpel had now reached the deadly tumor, and this was the moment that would decide everything. Clara leaned toward the screen, her eyes behind the loop examining every smallest detail, and she realized something her father had once warned her about in his lessons years before. The tumor had attached itself to the blood vessel in a way far more complex than the scan had shown. Following the ordinary safe route would not allow them to separate all of it, and if even one part were left behind, every effort would become meaningless. In that life-and-death moment, Clara had to make a choice no textbook could teach, a bold decision only her father, the man who had created this pathway, had ever dared to imagine. She could choose the safe way, withdraw and accept leaving part of the tumor behind. Or she could choose a more dangerous path, an angle so narrow that the slightest deviation would end everything. She closed her eyes for one brief moment, and in that darkness, it was as though she heard her father's voice returning from the evenings of her childhood, reminding her that sometimes the right path was the most terrifying one, and that a true physician had to have enough courage to walk it when a patient's life was lying in their hands. She opened her eyes, and with absolute resolve, she signaled for Nadia to follow that dangerous path. Every instruction from Clara now slow and precise down to the smallest fraction of a second. The whole room seemed to stop breathing. Nadia's hands moved according to every word Clara spoke, slowly, patiently, slipping through that fragile opening between life and death. Sweat gathered on the brows of the people in the operating room. The clock on the wall seemed to stop moving, and time itself seemed to shrink into a thin, stretched thread that could snap at any moment. Then, after minutes that felt endless, Clara softly uttered one sentence. "It's done." The deadly tumor, the thing an entire council of celebrated physicians had declared untouchable, had finally been removed completely. For a moment, no one in the operating room could speak. Silence covered the room, but it was no longer the silence of doubt or fear. It was the silence of people who had just witnessed something they believed impossible. Then from somewhere, a choked sob rose, and the whole team seemed to break open in quiet emotion, red-rimmed eyes looking at one another over their masks, needing no words to understand that together, they had just done something miraculous. Outside the operating room door, Elliot Vance had been standing there for many hours without moving half a step away. The most powerful man in Chicago, the one who could make an entire council turn pale with a single look, the man who had never known what helplessness felt like, now stood silently behind the frosted glass door, his hands clasped tightly together, completely powerless before the fate being decided on the other side. He had heard the alarm sound halfway through, and in those moments, his heart felt as though it were being crushed. All his money and power could do nothing except leave him standing there, waiting. When the operating room door finally opened, and when he saw Clara step out with an exhausted face but with eyes shining with the light of someone who had just won, he understood everything even before she had a chance to speak. She gave him a small nod, and that single nod was enough to make the shoulders of that iron-hearted man tremble. And for the first time in many years, Elliot Vance's cold, dark eyes blurred with tears. 2 days after the operation, in a recovery room filled with morning sunlight filtering through the window, Mrs. Ruth slowly opened her eyes. At first, the brightness made her squint, and everything was still blurred and distant. But little by little, the outlines of the room became clearer, and the first thing she saw was the face of her son leaning close beside her bed. Elliot had kept watch there for 2 days and 2 nights, without leaving, and when he saw his mother open her eyes, his throat tightened so hard he couldn't speak. He only took her hand gently, as though afraid this was only a dream that might vanish. "Mrs." Ruth looked at her son. Then her gaze slowly shifted to the other side of the hospital bed, where a woman sat quietly with dark circles beneath her eyes from lack of sleep and the steel loop still pinned at her collar. It took a moment for her drowsy mind to recognize who it was, and when she did, a tender smile bloomed across her pale face. "Mrs." Ruth tried to lift her weak hand, her fingers trembling because she was still so exhausted, and Clara hurriedly reached out to support it, holding that frail hand completely in her own. The old woman looked at her for a long time, her eyes bright with tears. Then in a hoarse and fragile voice filled with love, she whispered Clara's name. She said she had known it, that she had always known Clara wouldn't abandon her, that Clara was the angel God had sent to her in her darkest days. She said that from the first moment she saw Clara, she had felt a strange bond, as though fate itself had arranged for the two of them to meet. And now she understood why. She squeezed Clara's hand lightly and called her daughter, saying that if she could have chosen a daughter for herself, she wouldn't have wished for anyone but Clara. Those words broke through the last of Clara's restraint. Tears rolled down both her cheeks, and she bent down, pressing Mrs. Ruth's hand against her face, letting the warmth of a motherly love she had believed lost long ago once again warm her heart. While the two women held hands and cried, Elliot stood silently at the foot of the bed, witnessing it all, and something inside his chest broke open. This was a man who had gone through an entire life without ever bowing his head to anyone, a man accustomed to seeing others yield before him, a man who had built a fortress around his heart so cold it seemed nothing could ever move it. And yet now, Before the woman who had returned to him, the mother he had thought he had lost, he slowly stepped forward, and then he did something no one in this world had ever seen. He knelt. The most powerful boss in Chicago, the man who made the entire city cautious, lowered himself to one knee before a woman who had once been mocked by an entire council and escorted from the room like a madwoman. He did not kneel out of fear, because there was nothing left in this world that could frighten him. He knelt out of the deepest respect and gratitude one human being could offer another. His dark eyes lifted toward Clara, and when he spoke, the voice of that iron-hearted man trembled and caught in his throat. He said that he had spent his whole life believing money and power could buy everything, but she had taught him a lesson no amount of money could ever purchase, that the most precious things in this world could only come from the kindness and courage of a human heart. He thanked her not only for saving his mother, but for showing him that in a world filled with people willing to turn away, there were still those who chose to stay and fight for what was right. Clara hurried to help him stand, telling him that he didn't need to kneel before her, but Elliot only shook his head, and in that moment, all three people in that room, flooded with morning sunlight, understood that they had become something even stronger than blood, a family bound together by gratitude and understanding. While Mrs. Ruth recovered day by day in the sun-filled room, elsewhere in the city, Elliot Vance began casting his net. He was not the kind of man who would let a crime like that pass in silence, and with the full network of power he had built over so many years in the shadows, he quietly had his people dig deep into Marshall Kane's past. What they found was even more horrifying than anything Clara had ever told him. Layer after layer of truth was stripped bare. Old documents that had been hidden, statements from witnesses who years ago had been too frightened and had chosen silence, evidence showing that the work on the technique for approaching tumors at the base of the skull truly belonged to Dr. Daniel Reeves, and even traces proving that his death on that fateful rainy night had not been a random accident at all, but a carefully arranged plot to silence a man who had dared to stand up and demand the truth be returned. Piece by piece, Elliot gathered and arranged it all with meticulous care, until the full picture of Kane's crimes appeared clearly, without a single gap left for denial. When everything was ready, Elliot went to Kane's private office late one afternoon. The arrogant department chief was still seated behind his large desk with his familiar superior bearing. But when Elliot entered and silently placed the thick file on the tabletop, his face slowly changed color. Elliot did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply pulled out a chair and sat across from him, looked straight into Kane's eyes with his cold gaze, then slowly said that he knew everything, from the stolen work to the rainy night when Kane had made his move. He said that for all these years, Kane had lived comfortably on the blood and bones of an innocent man, had slept peacefully while a daughter had been forced to scrub floors just to survive, but all of that was about to end. For the first time in his life, the man who had always held his head high felt real fear crawling down his spine. He tried to salvage the situation, stammering offers of money, offering everything to settle it. But Elliot only stood, looked at him with contempt, and said a single sentence before leaving, that there were some debts money could not repay, and that Kane should spend the time he had left learning what it felt like to have everything taken away, just as he had done to the Reeves family. In the days that followed, the truth was brought into the light at a press conference that shook the entire medical world. Before a crowd of cameras and reporters, Dr. Daniel Reeves's honor was finally restored after so many years of being trampled into the dirt. It was officially acknowledged that the technique for approaching tumors at the base of the skull, the method that had just saved Mrs. Ruth Vance's life and promised to save countless other lives in the future, was his creation, and his name was fully restored to the pages of medical history. An official investigation into his death was also reopened, and with the evidence Elliot had gathered, the wheels of justice began turning in a direction nothing could stop. Marshall Kane was arrested right there in the hospital, where he had once ruled like a king, led away under the eyes of the very people who had once bowed their heads and flattered him, and the oil portrait of him in the main hall was taken down, leaving behind a bare stretch of wall. In the end, he received a fitting sentence for the crimes he had committed, not only for stealing a piece of work, but for taking one life and nearly taking another. In that storm of collapse, Eleanor Frost, the hospital's chief executive officer, could not remain untouched either. She was the one who had known, or at least suspected, the dark things Kane had done many years before, but had chosen to close her eyes and look away in order to protect the hospital's reputation and interests. Now, with the truth exposed, she could no longer hide from her conscience. She announced her resignation in an open letter, admitting that she had once placed her own security above justice, and that the highest price a person must pay is not when they make a mistake, but when they choose silence before the mistakes of others. That belated confession couldn't erase the years that had been lost. But it was an awakening, a reminder to everyone still watching that silence in the face of evil is also a form of guilt. Spring came to Chicago that year more gently than ever before. In the small garden in front of the old house, Mrs. Ruth had always longed for, the magnolia tree was in full bloom, its pure white petals opening beneath the early season sunlight, swaying softly in the warm breeze. Mrs. Ruth sat in the chair beside the familiar window, a thin blanket laid across her knees, her eyes shining with the simple happiness she had thought she would never again live to see. She had lived long enough to watch her magnolia tree bloom for one more spring. And more than that, she knew there were still many other springs waiting ahead of her. Beside her, Clara sat pouring tea, no longer in the faded silver maid's uniform, but like a true member of the family, and their warm laughter blended with the faint scent of magnolia drifting through the wind. Dr. Daniel Reeves's honor was restored not only through public declarations, but through a living legacy that would continue far into the future. A scholarship fund bearing his name was established, dedicated to poor medical students rich in talent and conscience. People who, without a hand reaching out to them, might have been left behind by life just as Clara once had been. Each year, that fund would lift up dreams that seemed to have nearly burned out, and the name of that true physician would live on in every generation of young doctors he had never met. As for Clara, with Elliot's help, she had begun the journey back to the white coat, this time not to serve anyone's glory, but to continue the path her father had opened, the path of saving lives. On one clear morning, Clara went to the cemetery where her father rested, a place lying on a gentle hillside now covered in the fresh green grass of spring. She stood silently before the simple gravestone for a long while, then reached up and removed the steel loop she had kept pinned at her collar for the past 2 years, the loop engraved with the 2 letters D and R, and placed it gently on the cold stone. She pressed her palm against the marker, and in a soft voice filled with peace, she whispered to her father that the woman had lived, that his path had saved a human life, and that he had been right from the beginning to the end. In the distance, Elliot stood quietly waiting for her beside the car, not as a powerful boss, but as a companion who would walk beside her on the roads ahead. Those 2 wounded souls had now found in each other a place to lean, an understanding that life rarely gives. The story of Clara Reeves reminds us of one simple yet profound truth, that a person's dignity never lies in the clothes they wear or in the work they do to survive, but in the heart they carry and the courage to stand up for what is right. In this life, each of us will one day stand before at least one choice, whether to pass by someone who needs help or to bend down and offer them a hand. And that choice, not status or wealth, is what truly defines who we are. Never be too quick to judge someone by what you see on the outside, because behind the plainest uniform, there may sometimes be an extraordinary heart and a story the whole world was too quick to overlook. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like, and share, so that every day you can hear more meaningful and captivating stories. How do you feel about Clara's story and her journey to reclaim justice? Please leave a few lines in the comments below, because we always hope to hear the honest feelings from deep within your heart. May everyone listening to this story always have abundant health, a joyful life, comfort, and peace every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next stories.